this was usually considered as invasion of the Donbass. Okay, so in 2004, Crimea was annexed. Luhansk and Donetsk were manipulated, and they were declared as independent, and they were called as the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic. That's how they were designated. With this, Russia began to slowly strengthen its grip over Ukraine. And in 2021, Russia gave an ultimatum to NATO, saying that NATO should give an undertaking that it is not going to integrate Ukraine. Obviously, integration of Ukraine into NATO would considerably reduce Russia's influence in East Europe. And of course, Ukraine would be an area where NATO's troops will be deployed, where NATO's missiles can be placed, which can make every square inch territory of such vast Russian state vulnerable or susceptible to missile strikes if the NATO's missiles are placed along the border in Ukraine. Now, this was a genuine concern, and therefore, Russia had given an ultimatum to NATO, seeking an undertaking from NATO that Ukraine would not be made a part of NATO. However, as the European Union failed to give any such guarantee that in future Ukraine would not be made a part of NATO, Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Now, this invasion, as I told you, had continued for a very long time, belying the Russian expectation that the victory would be swift. In fact, it was said by several Russian sources that Putin was contemplating on completing the war within 3 weeks. That was how much of miscalculation that Russian leadership had done in its invasion over Ukraine. However, now you know that Russian invasion of Ukraine resulted in occupation of several Ukrainian territories by Russia. And these include Luhansk, Donetsk, which were actually declared independent. Now, they were annexed and were made a part of Russian Federation. Apart from this, other territories like Kherson and Zaporizhia, now these were other territories that came under control of Russia. Now, please remember that by 2025, Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Crimea continued to be under the occupation of Russia. Considerable amount of the Donbass region, which accounts for the largest mineral resource of Ukraine. A significant amount of this region came under the control of Russia. Okay. Now, Russian invasion, therefore, brought mineral rich under control of Russia. It is said that the regions that Russia had occupied, which belonged to Ukraine, consist of mineral resources approximating around $21 trillion. Huge mineral wealth is present in these regions. Okay, and you know that this war had continued, dragged on for 4 years, the 4th year in running now, and you know that Ukraine had shown a tremendous resilience in the course of this war. And Russia began to speak about what was called as Novo Russia, okay, or New Russia, a revival of Imperial Russian Empire, a vision of Greater Russia. Now, this was what was being spoken about by Putin as well as several of his top brass military officials as well. Now, energy resources were seized by Russia, and lives were lost. Okay, now we know that this war had estimated the loss of around 2 million lives. Surprisingly, majority of the loss of life was on the Russian side. Also, it is said that this war had resulted in loss of around $1.6 trillion in terms of the loss to GDP, in terms of the loss in environmental wealth, loss in terms of resources. All these were estimated to be around $1.6 trillion. This was the scale of the war, and that's the reason why, war is always a crime, no matter how you justify it. or how necessary you feel it is. Loss of 2 million lives, loss of so much resource, loss of environmental wealth, you know, all this estimates are mind boggling, and all these estimates actually cast a question mark on moral claims of the modern societies. New terms were being employed, allegations of genocide, okay, systematic killing of communities, allegations of what's called as ecocide, destruction of ecosystems, and allegations of what's called as democide. Democide is the activity of an official acting in his official or authoritative capacity, killing civilians. That is what's called as democide. Okay, so civilians causing mass civilian casualties by authority acting in official capacity is called as democide. So allegations of genocide, ecocide, democide were leveled against Russians, and international criminal court opened investigations on charges of genocide, war crimes, abduction of Ukrainian children by Russians. Arrest warrants were issued against Putin and 4 other top leaders of Russia. So all these indicated the scale of the war, how much this war had impacted. Now, you also know that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was condemned worldwide. Okay, there were several countries which described Russia as a terrorist state. For example, countries like Poland and other Baltic states, they declared Russia as a Baltic state, a terrorist state. Similarly, a lot of countries supported Ukraine by extending humanitarian aid and military aid to Ukraine's war effort against Russia. Many countries imposed sanctions on Russia, imposed controls, self-imposed controls and curbs on trade with Russia, particularly oil trade as well. International Court of Justice ordered Russia to stop its military operations against Ukraine. A resolution was adopted in United Nations Organization, United Nations General Assembly, condemning Russia and demanding full withdrawal of Russia from Ukraine. All these were steps that were initiated as efforts to resist and to stop Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, Russian occupation of Ukraine continued nevertheless. What is more interesting here is the response of those countries which had given security assurance to Ukraine. Now, countries like US, UK, France, China, these countries were those who had given security assurance to Ukraine, along with Belarus as well as Kazakhstan, to surrender and renounce their nuclear weapons. However, throughout all the time that Russia was continuously violating the terms of the agreement, Budapest Memorandum, the response of these countries was lukewarm. The response of these countries was not in a way that it could stop Russia from its occupation. The response was not in a way which could protect Ukraine from the invasion of Russia. And this was the continuous allegation leveled by Ukraine. The response that we see from the signatories of the Budapest Memorandum does not in any way prove their commitment, or does not prove in any way their sincerity in stopping or curbing Russia. Now, this was the allegation leveled by Ukraine against the other signatories of this Budapest Memorandum. These countries, however, began to interpret the memorandum in different ways, saying that this memorandum only commits us to provide security assurance. It means that we would not in any way endanger the integrity or sovereignty or independence of Ukraine. It does not commit us to security guarantee. Security guarantee, on the other hand, is one in which we would be able to commit our armies to protect Ukraine. So security guarantee was not the terms of the agreement. Security assurance only was the terms of the agreement. Now, this was how the Western countries were trying to interpret the terms of the memorandum, and at best, it could be said that these countries were showing an escapist attitude in dealing with the Ukrainian issue. UK, US, and France provided financial and military assistance to Ukraine, and together these three countries were estimated to have provided around $330 billion of aid, military as well as civilian aid to Ukraine. Now, this is staggering. Much of this aid is in the form of debt to Ukraine. So, Ukraine will have to pay back. And looking at the condition of Ukraine as of now, Ukraine would be in no position to pay back this debt, this huge debt that these countries have extended to Ukraine towards its war effort. And that is one scenario where Ukraine might have to lose access to its own resources in future as a part of its debt servicing obligations. Okay, so that is another problem. The second one is that Western countries have not shown any readiness to engage with Russia directly, and therefore they began to depend more and more on indirect interventions in the form of sanctions and freezing Russian assets abroad and imposing visa restrictions on Russians, isolating Russia from international financial arrangements like SWIFT. Now, these were the things that the Western countries were doing. Indirect punitive measures were being imposed on Russia rather than any form of direct intervention. And thirdly, Europe began to feel more threatened now than ever before and began to nurture fears about Russian expansionist ambitions or designs. And therefore, Europe began to embark on the path of rearmament, strengthen their military preparedness. As Donald Trump had indicated that Europe should now begin to take responsibility for its own defense and should have boots on ground. It is this new change of perspective that European nations began to display after the Russian occupation of Ukraine. Partly, this kind of a change in the perspective of the European nations is also because of the repeated insistence of Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, that Russian ambitions extend much beyond Ukraine, and therefore Europe should rightfully start feeling threatened about Russia in the future. Now, it is these factors which made Europe try and pursue a little more military preparedness to face up to any potential threat from Russia in the future. In recent times, a peace proposal was forwarded by President Trump of US, a peace proposal which contained 28 points. A good number of people had begun to feel that the peace proposal that is proposed by US President is actually an acceptance of the wish list of Russia, primarily because the Russian demands were being conceded in this peace proposal prepared by or drafted by the American President Donald Trump. Now, what are the important points of this peace proposal? Firstly, this peace proposal territorially seeks to recognize all those territories which are occupied by Russia as part of Russian Federation, including Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk. However, Kherson and Zaporizhia are two regions which will be considered part of Russian Federation, but they will be considered as buffer where the Russian military will not enter, and even the Ukrainian military forces will not be able to enter. They will be retained as buffer regions, but they will be recognized as a part of Russian Federation. In exchange, Russia should renounce all other territorial claims over Ukraine. So in this way, sovereignty for Ukraine for the rest of its territories will be guaranteed or protected. This is one aspect of the peace proposal given by President Trump. What's happening effectively here is that the one who perpetrated the occupation of Ukraine is being rewarded, and the victim of this invasion is being punished. That's one aspect of the proposal given by Donald Trump. Now, Ukraine is today not in a position to prolong the war. this war had effectively become a war of attrition, where both the sides have begun to face huge losses. But because of the size of Russia, the size of Russian manpower and military, Russia would be able to sustain the campaign for a few more years. But that's not the case with Ukraine. Ukraine is running short of resources, Ukraine is running short of personnel, Ukraine is running short of supporters, Ukraine is running short of even aid from the Western and other foreign sources. Therefore, Ukraine is being pushed to accept the deal. But when we look at the peace proposal prepared by the Americans, the peace proposal to a very great extent serves the interests of Russia, surprisingly, America, and puts Ukraine at total loss. Almost like the terms that you offer to a country which is defeated in war. Looking at the scale of the destruction, we are always made to recollect that very famous quote of Ernest Hemingway when he says that war cannot be justified. Never think that war, no matter how necessary or how justified, is not a crime. Never think that. War is always a crime, no matter how justified it seems or how necessary it would look like. This was the very famous quote given by Ernest Hemingway, which explains that whether Russia is on the side of right or Ukraine is on the side of right, whoever or whatever had propped the countries to war, it still remains a crime. Thank you so much.